Before I dive in, I'd like to thank Pastor Phil for this invitation to preach. Growing up here at Parkview has been an absolute pleasure, and yet it is more than a bit intimidating to share with a congregation that I've known since I was a boy. One of my favorite aspects of Parkview is this incredibly high level of Christian thought, leadership, and wisdom, but a downside of that is that it leaves me, as nothing more than a young adult, feeling as if I may not have too much to share. I'll do my best nonetheless. Since it's been a while since I've been attending here at more than a sporadic college pace, I'll start with a short life update. After graduating from EMHS in 2014, I headed off to Kansas, where I did my first 2 years of school at Heston. Last year, I transferred to EMU, did 1 semester on campus, and then went to the Middle East on cross-cultural, an experience I think I won't ever be able to preach a sermon without referencing significantly, so you'll be hearing about that some. Then this past summer, I had an exploratory pastoral internship just outside DC, which is part of why I was invited to share today, at New Hope Fellowship, a small bilingual English-Spanish congregation. I'll graduate from EMU in just a couple months, assuming I don't get too bad of a case of senioritis. And as for the future, I'm currently in the process of applying for MCC SALT. For this reason, when I'm about to enter a huge period of life transition after 17 straight years in the formal education system, stories of call are stories that have particular meaning and depth to them at the moment. However, I in fact didn't pick these texts from thin air, but they were suggested via the lectionary. The lectionary, I find, is an incredibly profound spiritual practice that our church shares across numerous denominations. Working with it this week has reminded me of a particular conversation I had while on cross-cultural. Our group at one point had the chance to sit down with some young adult, about our age, modern Orthodox Jewish kids. And we had this really engaging conversation about our faith and faith practices. And their far more strict spiritual disciplines really hit home for me. Particularly, I remember something said by a young man named Austin. And he said that every morning when he woke up at dawn to bind the Shema to his hands and forehead, he would think not only was he worshiping God, but he was connecting with all of the other people around the world doing the same practice, specifically his brother in the U.S., who would be doing the exact same thing to start his morning. Following the liturgical calendar gives us the same opportunity. Though we may be fragmented into many denominations as Christians, we can form a horizontal connection to our fellow believers as well as a vertical connection to God. And though I didn't say it to my Jewish friends, I think this is even more important in Christianity, where the base of our faith is a symbol of a vertical and horizontal connection. Anyways, though the lectionary has advantages, it also has its downsides. The most obvious in my case was the fact that 2 weeks in a row, both the Old and New Testament passages were centered on God's call. Luckily for me, Phil chose to preach on the Psalm last week and left me to focus on call. Now, Jonah's story I find particularly interesting in these weeks after Christmas. Though we don't often think of these stories in the same context, they're both stories of one person saving a huge number of people. For Jonah, one of the largest cities in the world. For Jesus, all of us, and who many more. Throughout the sermon, I'll be trying to fit these stories, if not together, in the same boat, if you will. A main unifying theme of all of today's passages, as we already said, as well as the Christmas story, is call. And this is especially true of Jonah, where call is the focus of the whole book. Though we only read a portion, this children's time did a very good job of summing up the whole book. To begin, what did Jonah's call look like? We're left with almost no detail. At the beginning of the book and in today's passage, all it says is, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah." In our particular passage, it comes immediately after he is vomited up from the fish. Was he still sitting on the beach, I wonder, covered in spit, vomit, and seawater, breathing hard, when an angel appeared and told him to get on his stinking feet and start walking inland? Or, after surviving that ordeal, did he slink back to his home city and hope that God wouldn't call him again? The Christmas season, in the same way, is full of stories of call, possibly even more dramatic, though I'm sure with less whale vomit. Reading Jonah near Christmas time brings three things to the front about call. Firstly, God's call is serious and has broad-reaching effects for individuals, families, and societies. Secondly, the call is a call to justice. And thirdly, even the most important biblical figures have a reluctance to accept God's call. Before discussing these, though, let's dig a little deeper into the story. Jonah, of course, is most well known for his adventure with the fish, but that's only one of four main sections of the book. First, he chooses to evade God, attempting to go to Tarshish. Secondly, fish story. Third, the passage we read today, he goes to Nineveh, preaches, and converts the city. Finally, then, he complains to God and has this episode with the bush/vine. The book then ends rather abruptly with Jonah and God seemingly at odds with one another. I want to say a word about the fish or the whale or whatnot. In reality, I don't care too much about this fish. Is there a fish big enough to swallow a person? It doesn't seem that important to me. What matters more is what Jonah does before, after, and during his stay in the fish's belly. His life and faith inspire and save others, but only reluctantly. His experience in the fish clearly deepens his faith and desire to worship and follow God. Another reason I don't find it central to try and wrap my head around whether or not Jonah was actually swallowed by some leviathan is that Jonah as a whole works quite well as an allegory for the people of Israel. Many scholars wonder if a singular prophet Jonah ever really existed at all, or if this story is meant to represent the people. The fish becomes captivity, and the stories around it become centered on Israel's failure to collectively listen to God's call. Now then, on to the first point. God's call is a serious, or probably better stated, severe call that has broad-ranging social consequences. At face value, Jonah's character motivation is rather poor. Why, when the word of the Lord comes to him, does he run in the opposite direction? Tarshish is in modern-day Spain, the opposite side of the world under the Hebrew worldview. And the fact that Jonah chooses to sail at all is pretty telling. Early Israelites were not a sailing culture at all. Thinking back to Genesis 1, chaos and water are the same word. And throughout their history, the Hebrews were constantly clashing with the seafaring cultures like Philistines, Romans, and Greeks. What would make Jonah abandon his people and his land and travel to the ends of the earth? A call to go preach forgiveness in the enemy capital. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, the nation that would eventually conquer the northern Hebrew kingdom, Israel, where Jonah was called from. At the time of Jonah's writing, Israel had been in conflict and would continue to be so with Assyria for generations. Being called there is a huge, huge deal. Often during my time in the Middle East, we were told to keep in mind that the promised land, though we hear so much about it, is not actually a very good land, but merely a crossroads between the powers of Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. It's really only a land about the size of New Jersey, made up of unfarmable, good for nothing other than olive trees and herding. Nineveh is the opposite, sitting in the heart of the Fertile Crescent in modern-day Iraq. Nineveh is the capital of a sprawling empire sitting on the major east, west, and north-south trade routes of the entire known world. Jonah being called from Israel to Nineveh would almost be like a coal miner from West Virginia being told to go preach to the city of D.C., but only if West Virginia had been at war with the United States for decades. Jonah expected ridicule from his own people who would have viewed him as a traitor for going to Nineveh, but also ridicule from the Assyrian citizens who would have had no possible way of knowing who or what he was preaching about. Israel as a kingdom only held off Assyria's attempted invasions because they were viewed as so unimportant. And this brings us back to this serious or severe nature of Jonah's call. He was called not to some land he wanted to go to, but, pardon the pun, into the belly of the beast. He was called to shuck off his societal expectations of who God's word was for and go preach to the enemy. It really is no wonder, then, that he instead turned and ran away. And just after where we stopped reading today, he says exactly that. To Jonah, this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, "Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish, I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than live." But the Lord replied, "Is it right for you to be angry?" This is incredibly harsh language from Jonah, but not actually all that surprising. Had he tried to return to Israel after being a successful missionary, he would have been ostracized, if not killed, for taking their religion, private, small, and tied to birthright, to the enemy people, and removing Israel's only main safety weapon, God's protection and ability to fight for them. While God was sending Jonah to Nineveh, it's not hard to imagine the entire nation of Israel sitting in their synagogues, praying for God to destroy that city. Looking at Jonah as an allegory, then, this is the crux of that story. God called the people of Israel, Jonah, to be a missionary to the other peoples of their day, but instead, they were hesitant and simply wanted God's blessing for themselves. This is the crux of the failure of the Old Covenant. God's call to Abraham to be a people through which all the peoples of the world would be blessed was boxed into simply being a call to be a people devoted to their own laws and own salvation rather than the salvation of other peoples. It's also intriguing to think how the book of Jonah would have been perceived at the time of Jesus, at the time of the Christmas story. Though it was part of the canon, I don't think it would have been read that frequently. The equivalent of Jesus' day would have been the call to go preach forgiveness in Rome itself. And indeed, we see how many pitfalls and how despised this choice is when Paul and Peter try and do it. This call to preach to the Gentiles would not have been popular at all in the Jewish community throughout the entire Bible. These are just a few isolated examples of how difficult it is to fulfill the call, but there are so many more throughout the Bible, from Mary, Joseph, and the wise men to Abraham. Almost all the calls require sacrifice. But how do we remove that? But how often do we, as a modern church, remove that risk from call stories today? How often are we in the modern church limiting God's call to things that aren't risky financially, familially, socially? Maybe recklessness isn't exactly a requirement for faith calls, but giving up of financial security, career direction, and familial and social security is at the very least highly suggested. Following God's call to justice is messy. And that brings us to our second main point. The call to Jonah in light of Christmas is a call to God's justice. We often think of this idea of justice, but the Bible is full of stories of justice being misrepresented, misunderstood by characters' own experiences and desires. Jonah is a perfect example of the difference between desired, retributive justice and the radical shalom justice God promises. Just as God says and asks to Jonah, does he really have a right to be angry about forgiveness of others when he himself has been forgiven after attempting to evade God? In some regards, yes. Assyria, the wealthy capital of the empire that conquered and treated its subjects so horribly, an experience the kingdom of Israel was about to go through, deserved judgment in Jonah's own eyes. But in other ways, obviously not. God is pleased, asking this rhetorical question, that Jonah has successfully converted the city. Jonah shouldn't be angry. And as a preacher, in fact, converting one of the largest cities in the world in one day really isn't too bad of a day's work. But Jonah lost sight of what really mattered, just as the whole kingdom of Israel did. God's call was not just about him or the kingdom. It was about everyone, about an open promise to all who believed. This only became more and more emphasized in the New Testament and through Jesus. However, this could be another area where we are in danger of sliding again as a modern church, overemphasizing the importance of only our own community's relationship to God, or only our personal relationships to God, to the detriment of sharing the good news and doing good works for all, is in danger of falling into the same pitfall of the Old Testament. Limiting our view of the good news the good news that God has in store is always dangerous. Limiting God never works out in the end. And that leads us to our last point. The call can be resisted. As we already discussed, Jonah attempted to resist it. This is a pretty familiar example of it. But we don't often think about temptation in this way today, as turning a blind eye or deaf ear to what God is calling us to do. We see this temptation further laid out in the two scripture passages we read today. The 1 Corinthians passage, all about how important going all in for faith isn't quite as effective to me as the image as calling the disciples. But still, for how many generations since the Reformation have we ignored Paul's call to a monastic lifestyle? God's severe call to justice is best done through an all-in lifestyle with as few distractions as possible. The time is short. This is also shown in the Mark passage. I think we tend to underemphasize how big of a decision the disciples made when they chose to follow Jesus. Here they were, on a normal day, working with their fathers, and along comes a character who they've never met, about to change their lives. Having grown up working for my own dad and occasionally struggling with the desire to simply walk away, I think I understand their decision. But at the same time, the choice to leave a family business that likely only succeeded because of their labor to follow a strange rabbi would definitely have been a life-defining decision. They knew it then, not just later when the miracles started, right when they walked away from their jobs. Leaving their fathers there would have been a career-ending choice, a betrayal to their own family, giving up the familial birthright to the business. They likely would not have been taken back by their fathers even if they wanted to return later. They accepted God's serious call to the detriment of financial and familial well-being. I wonder, did Jesus have to stop at some other boats and ask for followers before he found Simon and Andrew and James and John? It's not too hard to imagine that he did have to. All of these stories are good stories of call demonstration, but honestly, they leave me a little frustrated. If it were only as simple, I think, as getting out of the boat and following Jesus. If the word of the Lord came to me, of course I would follow the call I say. This, however, is the exact opposite of the points these passages are trying to make. The call is always messy, confusing, and incredibly sacrificial. There are always reasons to stay behind, whether they be friends or family or job security. Looking at the Bible as a time of mystery and clear calling cheapens the experience of reading it. People during biblical times were just as likely to resist, just as likely to be frustrated and confused and in danger of social and economic ruin. If we limit ourselves to the easy, to the simple and the safe, we rule out so much of God's message. As Todd Winward, director of MCUSA's Watershed Discipleship Program, said this week in an EMU chapel about Martin Luther King, don't just spend your life making a security blanket to hide under. Jonah, the disciples, and characters in the Christmas story were all changed and left the boats on the side of the shore. They left their sources of income and their families and followed the call into the unknown. This is what we should aspire to, both as individuals and as a church. May it be so.